So I would like to give a very warm welcome to all the participants to this awareness webinar on Enpr-EMA, which stands for the European Network of Pediatric Research at the EMA. My name is Irmgard Eichler, and I'm working in the Pediatric Medicines Office at the EMA, and I'm also co-chair of Enpr-EMA together with Dr. Mark Turner. In the interest of time, I would like to immediately start with my presentation, and I will ask my colleague Isabel to put my presentation on screen so that we can start. My presentation will focus on introduction and presenting Enpr-EMA to you. So the European network, or Enpr-EMA, was set up by the European Medicines Agency in accordance with Article 44 of the Pediatric Regulation, which mandated the agency to develop a network of existing national and European networks, investigators and centers with specific expertise in the performance of studies in the pediatric population. The agency's management board adopted an implementing strategy for the network, outlining the organizational structure of such a network. And in 2011, Enpr-EMA was officially launched at the first workshop that was open for all stakeholders, including industry, patients, parents, group representatives. The need for such a network was foreseen by an anticipated increase in pediatric clinical studies after entry into force of the EU Pediatric Regulation. And in fact, as you can see in those two graphs from the 10-year report on the EU Pediatric Regulation, which was sent to the European Commission and recently published, as you can see in the reference put on this slide, there was an increase in pediatric studies, and particularly in those studies requested in pediatric investigation and plans, which are abbreviated with PIPs on this slide, conducted also in the European Union. The report summarizes the experiences over the last 9 years with the progress of pediatric studies. And as you can see on the pie chart on the left-hand side of this slide, while approximately 60% of all pediatric studies for those products that are already authorized in adults progress as agreed and as planned, 40% do not. And the main problem being difficulties with the recruitment, as is shown in the pie chart on the right-hand side of this slide. So, why is recruitment so difficult? This slide, which is adapted after Dr. Sam Maldonado, sums up the feedback we repeatedly hear from industry, that across pediatric populations it is difficult to find qualified sites, to identify experienced pediatric investigators, and to access the necessary patient populations for clinical studies. So Enpr-EMA was set up as an umbrella network of existing networks to facilitate studies relating to pediatric medicinal products and to provide access to networks and sites with the expertise in performing clinical trials in the pediatric population. And by doing so, to facilitate recruitment of patients. And through enabling collaboration and learning of networks from within and outside the European Union, to build up and strengthen complementary scientific, technical and or administrative competencies in the performance of pediatric clinical studies. However, it is important to stress that Enpr-EMA per se does not conduct studies. They are conducted and performed by the individual networks. And that will be discussed in the following presentation by Mark Turner. Members from Enpr-EMA are conducting studies in various areas and crossing all pediatric age ranges from newborns to adolescents and ranging from pharmacokinetics to pharmacovigilance studies. ensure certain quality standards, Enpr-EMA members themselves have introduced a set of so-called minimum recognition criteria which have to be fulfilled in order to become Category 1 member of Enpr-EMA, which is the requirement and prerequisite to be eligible as a coordinating group member. And I will come back to what the coordinating group is doing in the next slides. Those recognition criteria were developed, as I mentioned, by the networks themselves, by consensus formation techniques, and focus on the following 6 domains: research experience and ability, efficiency requirements, scientific competencies and capacity to provide expert advice, quality management, training and educational capacity, and involvement of patients, parents, or their organizers. And the proof and evidence that they fulfill those criteria to the EMA or Enpr-EMA Secretariat, and this self-assessment form has to be updated every 2nd year. This slide gives you now an overview of all networks which are currently registered within the Enpr-EMA database. We currently have a total of 14 networks with 16 national multi-specialty networks and several specialty networks. As you can see, among the national multi-specialty networks, Enpr-EMA also has members from outside Europe, such as the Canadian Mother-Child Youth Research Network with the abbreviation of MICYRN, and the Duke Clinical Research Institute, the first on the list of national networks, but also the National Center of Child Health in Tokyo, Japan. And the various specialty networks, such as Sprinter in the field of rheumatology or Penta in the field of HIV and infectious diseases, include international sites and therefore have the capacity to perform global pediatric studies. The various color codes do reflect the category or status of the network. So green means these networks are Category 1 networks, which is networks that fulfill all the minimum criteria. Category 2 are networks which potentially fulfill all the minimum criteria, but we still need a few clarifying proofs in order to reclassify them as Category 1. Category 3 are those who currently do not yet fulfill minimum criteria, but nevertheless are registered in the database and are invited to all Enpr-EMA meetings which take place every year in order to share good practice and increase dialogue among them. Then we have a separate Category 4, it's the black one. Those are networks who do not perform clinical trials, but they do have expertise either in clinical trial methodology or are networked to provide infrastructure such as ECRA. All registered networks are listed in the Enpr-EMA database that provides a quick access to the networks with the identification of the contact person, therapeutic areas of interest, and links to the network's individual homepage, and all the information provided by the networks in the self-assessment form, which I have been mentioning in my previous slide. So I try now to open this, can I open the link to show you, the link over there. Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. This link leads you to the Enpr-EMA database, and if you go to search function, and then you can have find on the right hand side show all networks, and if you click on this then it directs you directly to all the networks, and those networks you can click on whatever you want to. We choose, I don't know, we choose anyone, and it will open the first introduction site with the contact details and how to reach out to this and how you can reach this network. But if you go to, for instance, competence or network, then you will get the information on the number of peer-reviewed publications, for instance, so about the experience of this network and so on. If we go back to the search function, please. No, back over there, search. Yeah, here, no, next one, search, yeah. And for instance, you would like to look for multi-specialty, and we put in we would like to know whether there is a network in the, I don't know, let's take Netherlands, and then we would like to have multi-specialty. No idea whether I can find it. Here. And then click on search. Then you will find that there is a Dutch Medicines for Children research network, and if you click on this one, it will give you all the information that you will need. So if we now go back to presentation. And I think it's now slide number 12. Next one. I go down. Thank you, Isabel. So, okay. And we put it on the big screen. So, next one. The operational center of Enpr-EMA is the so-called coordinating group, which has 20 members, one representative per recognized network, 2 members of the pediatric committee to ensure a very close dialogue with the PDCO, the abbreviation for the pediatric committee at the EMA. 1, and that is a voluntary representative of the European Commission, and a maximum of 4 additional members for additional expertise. That could be patient representatives, ethics committee representatives, or on an ad hoc basis. In addition, the coordinating group has also 2 industry representatives as observers, one nominated by FDA and the second nominated by UCOP to represent SMEs. The coordinating group is co-chaired by a chair elected from among the members and 1 staff from EMA, and at time present I am co-chair. The coordinating group is responsible for the network's long and short-term strategy, and its tasks include to address operational and scientific issues, to agree on scientific quality standards, and to act as a forum for communication. And it also might include to identify new networks which could be included into Enpr-EMA, and I will come back to that a little bit later. So what can Enpr-EMA now offer to industry? It is a single entry portal, and as such it provides access to expert advice with regard to, for instance, treatment options, current standard of care, pediatric needs, feasibility of pediatric clinical trials. And you will hear more about this by Mark Turner. But it also provides access to a pool of patients for inclusion, and thus speeding up recruitment. It provides access to parent-patient input with regard, again, for instance, on the feasibility of trial, on what kind of use of diaries or trial duration, what could be acceptable for them. And it acts as a neutral platform for multi-stakeholder meetings with investigators, networks, patient-parent representatives, and regulators. In addition, we also have established, Enpr-EMA has established a collaboration with EMA's SME office to offer access to academic partners. If you click then on this link, you will be, you come to the information that is provided on the Enpr-EMA web page. Because agency, SME office and Enpr-EMA, we have agreed to act as liaison for investigators and SME for in pediatric medicine research. So if, for instance, an SME is in need for looking academic centers to conduct clinical trials for their product and do not really have access to find those investigators or centers with the capacity to do those studies, then we could help you. just send a very short information as outlined on the Enpr-EMA webpage. So to summarize, the key operational goals and the role of Enpr-EMA is that as a platform for interaction between all stakeholders to facilitate the conduct of small and larger studies in the pediatric population, but also to link together the existing networks within the EU, but also beyond EU and on international basis, to share best practices, to offer a single point of contact for networks, and that is the email address where you can reach out and send all your queries to Enpr-EMA. And as I mentioned before, to define strategy for resolving major challenges. But please again note, and that is important, Enpr-EMA does not fund or conduct clinical trials or act as a CRO or manages studies. So the roles of Enpr-EMA include to identify problems and challenges for individual networks, and to act as a European voice to raise awareness on those challenges and difficulties on a European level. For instance, Enpr-EMA repeatedly mentioned and officially commented to the public consultation of the European Commission 5-year report on the pediatric regulation by reporting the lack of sufficient infrastructure funding for many networks, with the negative consequence that many networks struggle with or are unable to sustain high-quality services. This helped and contributed to the soon-to-be-launched IMI2 project on a European-wide pediatric clinical trial network with sufficient funding for basic infrastructure. The role of Enpr-EMA also includes to propose solutions, as some of the ad hoc Enpr-EMA working groups have done. The working groups include network and industry representatives as well as PDCO members, and they were set up in order to address the most important identified needs. For example, a working group on the dialogue and interaction with ethics committees identified that a major hurdle for industry and companies is to find what are the different requirements for informed consent among the various EU member states. So this working group compiled all the information with regard to legislative surroundings listed by the country, and published it very recently in the Archives of Diseases in Childhood. And this table is also published on the Enpr-EMA website. So if you could click on this link, then you will find the various requirements for informed consent listed among the various countries. And the list is now and will be regularly updated by Enpr-EMA. Another working group identified, another working group was to try to improve the communication and collaboration between networks and industry. And they conducted 2 surveys. One for industry members, which was sent out to approximately 600 industry representatives, and to the 20 Category 1 networks of Enpr-EMA. And the results showed and allowed this working group to create specifications for a so-called ideal pediatric clinical trial network to provide best possible coverage and services to pharmaceutical industry. The results are summarized in this article in Applied Clinical Trials, which was published this year, and it also includes recommendations both for industry and networks how to better collaborate and improve the communication. Some benefits which have been identified by industry when they have been contacting networks are listed on this slide, such as that they gained increased confidence with the clinical development program, that they had then, which resulted in a better development of the clinical trials, that they had kind of improved patient recruitment through highly skilled and motivated investigators. They were guided through perceived pitfalls with trial feasibilities. Some of the networks, they do have electronic databases of physicians and sites who conduct clinical trials. And they also mentioned that it was a benefit to the patient who could then be treated outside of his or her country through network collaboration. But they also mentioned that it was difficult sometimes to find the right network to collaborate with. And with this regard, Enpr-EMA can help. Another working group was focusing on involvement of young people, and they conducted a survey to review what Enpr-EMA members do already have an established young persons advisory group. And what they found was that 6 networks do have advisory groups, such as the one in Canada, in Scotland, England, Barcelona, France. And there's also a neonatal parent forum which do involve parents. The majority of those young people advisory groups consist of about 10 to 20 members, with members' age ranges between 11 to 20 years. And if those advisory groups can provide advice, then these were the areas where they were able to provide advice on. That was with regard to clinical trial protocols, research needs, participant and patient documentation, information for young people, and patient experience, and also available hospital facilities. So what this working group now plans to do in the future is to develop a database of young persons group as a resource for the agency and also pharma industry, and to develop operational links between those existing groups so that their projects can be cascaded amongst the groups and that they can work collectively in providing their expertise and advice in a collaborative way. Canadian and US groups are involved via the ICANN umbrella, and ICANN stands for the International Children Association of Network Groups, and this group was established based on the experience from some young persons advisory groups in Europe. And this International Children Network ICANN was launched last year in the US and had again the second summit this year in Barcelona. The most recent ad hoc working group of Enpr-EMA was kicked off in May this year based on the difficulties encountered with the conduct of pediatric trials with antibiotics. And this working group is tasked to review current international regulatory guidance in pediatric clinical trials, to review the literature on planned and already conducted antibiotic trials, to summarize the key similarities and differences between children and adults, and to summarize key barriers in the design and conduct of pediatric antibiotic trials. And then to compile and summarize all those findings in a summary document, and the timelines are next year, first quarter of next year. I mentioned that the task of the coordinating group is also to identify new networks. This group, the coordinating group, has identified, back in 2011, that there are quite a few therapeutic areas where there are no established specialty networks. So a meeting was organized, and since then, 2 specialty networks in the field of pediatric gastroenterology, which up until then there was no such a network, have been established. The so-called PETCRAN, and you have the link listed on this slide, and the European Pediatric Liver Transplantation Network. Both are now members of Enpr-EMA. And another area where there was, up until 2011, no specialty pediatric network was in the field of pediatric endocrinology and diabetes. And since then, also a network in this area has been established, the European Children and Adolescent Diabetes and Endocrine Trials Network. And most recently, the Pediatric Assembly from the European Respiratory Society has obtained a grant from the ERS to establish a so-called clinical research collaboration for enhancing participation of asthmatic children in therapeutic trials of new biologics. And the kickoff meeting of this group was in May this year at the EMA, and the next meeting will take place in March next year. So at the end of my presentation, I would very quickly like to show you how you will find the information on Enpr-EMA, because we have been told that that is not an easy task, and quite a few people struggle to find Enpr-EMA within the EMA webpage. So if you go to the entry page of EMA webpage, then go to Partners and Networks and click on this one, you come to the network website, and then please, no, that is now, the red thing is now a little bit misplaced, but if you go on your left-hand side to the directory of networks and click on Enpr-EMA, you will here find European Network of Pediatric Research at the European Medicines Agency, and with the link already, and if you click on this link, then you will come to the Enpr-EMA webpage. So it is not really easy, but I do hope that this step-by-step guide will help you to find the information. So in conclusion, Enpr-EMA is a thriving forum for interactions between networks, industry, CROs, regulators, and children and families. It is established as a pan-European voice to promote research into medicines for children, as a platform for sharing good practices among networks within Europe and with other regions of the world, and it provides access as a single point of contact for European pediatric clinical research networks. And direct collaboration with industry has been initiated not only through the fact that industry representatives are members of the various Enpr-EMA working groups, but also that now industry representatives have been nominated by FBR and UCOB as observer within the coordinating group. And with this one, I would like to thank for your attention and now ask Mark to take over for his presentation of the individual networks.
Hi, thanks so much, Irmgard, and I'd like to echo your words about UCOP and FPR, who have been very helpful in developing both this webinar and the more general aspects of Enpr-EMA. My name is Mark Turner. I'm a neonatologist based in Liverpool, England, and my research interest is in early phase drug development in premature babies, but also there are infrastructures that we all need to develop clinical trials. If I could have the next slide, please. So we've already heard that there's been a significant increase in both the number of trials and the number of participants that have been mandated through the pediatric regulation, and delays in trial execution are now significant and reducing the benefit that children are gaining from the regulation. Networks can address these issues. Most networks optimize trial delivery, and knowledge about how to do that is there for us all to share. In many cases, there's good practice about clinical trials to share, and if you or your colleagues find that you're spending time designing solutions to clinical trial challenges in children, then I suspect you're not using your time effectively. Most problems have been overcome by somebody, and the networks know across specialties, across countries, who has solved which problem. So if you think you've got a problem about blood sampling or PK or outcomes, then the networks are there to show you how other people have overcome those problems already. Many people work with very good key opinion leaders, but those key opinion leaders are often experts in their field of clinical expertise, but may not have broad expertise in clinical trials or in regulatory affairs. And the networks can supplement the work of established key opinion leaders. So in general terms, clinical research networks support the advancement of knowledge that improves outcomes for children by facilitating the diffusion of information, the diffusion of studies, the diffusion of expertise, and the diffusion of databases. But each network does this in different ways. Few networks can do all of these tasks, but it's worth asking them what they can do, because they may be able to help as a network, or they may be able to signpost you towards relevant expertise. Next slide, please. So clinical research networks have resources that are available to all sponsors and funders across all therapeutic areas. And it may not be possible for one sponsor or one contract research organization to maintain the spread of expertise that networks can have. Networks include sites that deliver, and from that expertise with delivery, they can develop intelligence which improves delivery but also improves the design of studies going forwards. Next slide, please. Everything that we do needs to be embedded in the experience of study participants. And there are two reasons to do this. First of all, many people will say no research without us. Next slide, please. And there's this ethical reason to involve participants in the trials that we do. But there's also an operational value in that talking to children, young people, and their families can improve the quality of clinical trials and speed up their delivery. Talking to study participants or other children and young people through an honest broker can identify therapeutic needs, can improve study design and acceptability of studies, and people can contribute to documentation, as we've heard. Next slide, please. So Imgard has mentioned young people's advisory groups that can be contacted through ICANN. Next slide, please. So some networks are more developed than other networks. The well-developed networks include sites that have recognized capabilities and that consistently meet quality standards. A well-developed research network will use targets and will actively manage sites and trials using those targets. Metrics will drive performance management. This then leads to improved intelligence about feasibility, acceptability, and networks can include this with condition-specific factors. All of this leads us to more informed decisions about how many patients to include in a trial. We should do this before the study, but we can sometimes work on this during a study as well to redirect effort towards the places where we can find patients. Next slide. So the best way to use a network is to put most effort into identifying therapeutic need so that your efforts to develop medicines take account of what children actually need. Networks can contribute to due diligence about particular molecules, both within companies and during transfer of molecules between companies. It's very important, when possible, to involve networks in discussions such as pre-IND meetings at the FDA or the development of pediatric investigation plans at the EMA, because networks can provide independent data that can be verified and will make the conversations more direct if you know how many patients are needed, how many patients are available, what the standard of care is across multiple settings, and so on. Networks don't work so well if all they do is implement protocols, and we'd rather not try and rescue protocols because our effort is much better spent developing good protocols in the future. So this slide suggests how not to use networks. If you ask us to put all our effort into implementing protocols or rescuing protocols, then we cannot change things. Working with networks will not change a bad protocol into a good protocol. If it's difficult to recruit to a trial in many sites, that may be because the feasibility is wrong, the standard of care is wrong, or the design is not appropriate for children. It's much easier to identify those problems before the trial starts by talking to networks that can help you. Next slide, please. So some networks can take study sponsors from the initiation of their project through to data by working with you on the pediatric investigation plan, on the protocol, on country selection, on site selection, and on finding participants, so that sites and participants can be constantly updated depending on what's needed. And next slide, the networks can also help with trial design. And this can be done by sharing information about real-world data to do with incidence and feasibility of studies and conditions. They can identify similarities between adults and children, and thus help you to use adult data to minimize studies in children, which will help implement the extrapolation concept paper from the agency, together with standards of care and looking at which assessments are feasible. Networks will help you directly or by signposting you towards relevant experts. Next slide, please. So networks can provide an interaction between implementation and design that speeds up trial delivery when the study has been finalized. Next slide. I need to stress that this is a learning process. Networks are ready to learn from industry, but we also need some companies to learn from networks. Not all networks can do the activities I've outlined, but all of them can contribute to some of these activities, and it's well worth asking to find out what people can do. As Irmgard says, the networks are not funded. They're often voluntary and try to help where they can, and so you get what you pay for most of the time. And I think that's worth thinking about as we move forwards, about how we can develop networks to meet the needs that we all have. Next slide, please. One way to do this will be through this topic that the Innovative Medicines Initiative have put forward. This is potentially included in IMI 2 called 10, and a draft indicative text is available, but if this network is formed, then it would overcome many of the resource issues and allow us to generalize good practice across many networks across Europe. Next slide. So, how to use networks? Please contact the networks early, but please maintain a single contact point between the network and your organization. We favor each company having a relationship business manager with each network. This will vary between companies. You may want to have one relationship business manager for the whole company, or within each product development team. But each network can find talking to industry, talking to each company, just as confusing as companies find talking to sites. If we don't have one single contact point, then we can't pass on shared learning. If there are 10 contact points between a contract research organization and the sponsor, then it's difficult for networks or sites to give effective feedback. And I know companies find it difficult when they can never track down the right person at each site or within each country, but it works both ways, and networks need consistent contact points within companies. In addition, it is very helpful if companies can develop horizontal links between product teams or between therapeutic areas, so that the corporate memory is enriched by working with networks. We are told that product teams benefit from networks, and they say they'd work with the network again, but none of their colleagues get to hear about it, so that the networks have to be rediscovered by a different product team. So this is an inefficiency which we can all work together to overcome. Next slide, please. So I'll conclude there, and I think now we've got time for questions and answers. Irmgard?
Yes, and we have received quite a few questions in advance, both from Enpr and from UCOPE, and we would suggest that we are going to present them now to you. And when we have still time, then please also you can put your questions in writing, and if we have time left, then we will answer them. So the first question that we received was, how concretely Enpr-EMA is facilitating the pharmaceutical industry access to pediatric clinical study centers and experts? And the answer is that please understand Enpr-EMA as a signpost. It can facilitate access through the searchable Enpr-EMA database by providing information about the contact details, about the relevant networks with the capacity to conduct pediatric studies, and whether or not they do have the capacity to provide expert advice. The next question was, what is the concrete practical and operational service that Enpr-EMA is offering to sponsors? Well, as I tried to demonstrate in my presentation, to provide access to existing networks, be it multi-specialty national or therapeutic area-specific specialty networks, and as alluded in the presentation by Mark Turner, to the various services that networks can offer. Enpr-EMA, through its collaboration with the EMA SME office, also provides access to academic investigators if there is such a need. And Enpr-EMA can also offer to act as a neutral platform for multi-stakeholder meetings, including PDCO members, including patient-parent representatives, in addition to industry and network representatives, to discuss general issues and challenges related to pediatric medicine's development. The next question was, is there any global cooperation with US and other regions? And yes, as I showed in one of my slides, we do have international network members within Enpr-EMA, such as the Canadian network, which includes all 17 child and maternal health units and the 3 largest maternal health research organizations of Canada, and which is Category 1 Enpr-EMA member. We also have collaboration with the US Duke Clinical Research Institute, which is also Category 1 Enpr-EMA member, and with Tokyo. And as I mentioned in my presentation, several networks do have international collaboration. One question was also, what is the advantage of Enpr-EMA if you can reach out to the networks independently? Well, yes, you please feel free to do so in case that a marketing authorization holder already knows exactly what networks would be most useful for their needs, so definitely there is no need to go through Enpr-EMA. However, what Enpr-EMA can offer you is to reach out and offer additional networks. Then it would be great to add more information regarding the study experience, the number of company-sponsored trials, and what type of studies the networks already have been conducted. And yes, thank you for the suggestions. We definitely will feedback this to our network members and ask them whether they could provide more information, maybe in the self-assessment form, which is accessible in the Enpr-EMA database, or maybe on their own individual network website. The next question. In one case, a network was identified through Enpr-EMA and reached out to, but there was no interest in the specific study, which of course can happen, and yes, that can happen. Many networks do have a scientific board that takes decision whether or not the proposed study could or should be done by the network. And other networks, they disseminate the query to individual investigators, and then it's up to them to decide whether or not they want to participate in the proposed study. So in the end, it's the individual decision of the individual investigators if there is no scientific board existence within a network. Another interesting comment was that it seems that the search function in the Enpr-EMA database only use British English. And again, we thank for this helpful comment, and we definitely will have a look into it and try to how we can best address it. And then we received a few questions from UCOPE. The first one, as Enpr-EMA is a network of physician practitioners understanding the clinical pediatric framework, when marketing authorization holders encounters feasibility issues, will there be, and they reach out to investigators, will they then be involved in the comp assessment to bring their expertise to conclude the best way forward for the PIP? So the short answer is no. Because Enpr-EMA is not involved in any product-specific individual procedure of any committee. If a network representative has been in discussion with a company regarding a PIP in preparation, he or she would clearly be considered as having a conflict of interest and would be excluded from participation in the committee discussion. Having said that, however, industry can approach networks and are actually encouraged to do so, as we have done in the question and answer session of the Enpr-EMA webpage. And the question is, why should I consider involving pediatric networks when preparing the PIP? And as you can read then in the provided answer is that networks can provide information about pressures arising from multiple medicines in a small population and other aspects of clinical trials, as alluded to in the presentation by Mark Turner. So please, you really feel free and you're really encouraged to contact networks already in the phase of preparing a PIP to address all potential pitfalls and difficulties with feasibility and trial design, etc. How is Enpr-EMA collecting epidemiology data to help support the needs and unmet medical needs for the targeted group in children and for each subgroup? So several networks do have either their own database or have access to relevant databases to provide the requested information. But as Mark Turner already mentioned, not all networks do have this capacity, but it is worthwhile to reach out and ask them. Can Enpr-EMA advise on the science and medical evidence to highlight the differences in pathology as compared to adult indication? So please, if you have such a question or related similar scientific question, please send questions to Enpr-EMA via the email address enpr-ema@ema.europa.eu, and the Enpr-EMA Secretariat will then forward the query to relevant Enpr-EMA network members, which then could be able to answer and provide you the requested information. Alternatively, feel free to use the Enpr-EMA database and contact relevant networks yourself. And then we received a kind of comment and questions which state that it's critical to be able to bridge the knowledge in adults to the one in children to avoid unnecessary and ghost trials. And yes, we can only support this statement. So whenever it is possible, then it is important to bridge the knowledge in adults to other populations. And this approach is described in the agency's reflection paper on extrapolation. And we had, the agency recently hosted this year a large workshop on extrapolation. So marketing authorization holders are encouraged to seek scientific advice about this issue, to what extent extrapolation might be accepted. And networks may be able to help by suggesting relevant experts. So these were the questions that we have been receiving so far. And I think we still have some time, so please, whenever you would have questions, then we are happy to reply to them.
I will try to see if I can make it. Oh, sorry.
Okay, Irmgard, shall I go first with Vivian's question?
Yes, but you are apparently better in position to read the comments than I am from the distance.
Okay, so Dr. Kessler asks, please comment on the divergence of network approaches, often from ex-EU standards, often resulting in divergent pediatric development programs which can be not only difficult to operationalize, but result in delays in marketing drugs in rare diseases, for example, inflammatory bowel diseases. So I can think of two reasons why a trial might diverge from European standards. The first reason is differences in national approaches, and the second is differences driven by clinicians. The national differences remain a fact of life within the European Union and associated countries, while the pediatric regulation is law across all EU countries and associated states. There are many competencies which remain at the national level, such as ethics committees and the approval of trials by national competent authorities. At present, this means that national ethics committees and national competent authorities can introduce differences to trials after the pediatric investigation plan has been approved. And we find this extremely frustrating in publicly funded studies, because we can have one protocol that's approved in France but is not approved in Sweden, or which needs heavy amendment in Spain. And that is a function of national member state competences. Sometimes there may be differences introduced by clinicians as well. In that situation, the clinicians are normally reflecting their standard practice, and so the way to overcome that is to work with all the relevant clinicians during protocol development. Because if they've got a standard of care that's incompatible with a particular trial, then you can change that during protocol development, or you can miss that country out. So when clinicians introduce differences, then that can be accommodated, preferably before the trial opens. But at the moment, when countries, through ethics committees or competent authorities introduce differences, that's very difficult to change. Moving forward, with the implementation of the clinical trials regulation, some of these differences between countries may disappear, but I can't promise that every member state in Europe will have the same attitude to ethics or to clinical trial regulation. And so there are some issues that Europe needs to overcome before it be completely seamless. Imgard, do you have any comment?
Yes, thank you, Mark. That was very comprehensive. The only thing that I would like to add is that there might also be differences between the agencies' positions between EMA and FDA sometimes. And in order to overcome those potential differences, there is a regular telephone conference between those two agencies discussing the pediatric investigation plans. And in the field, for instance, of gastroenterology, for Crohn's disease, for instance, where initially there have been identified differences between the requirements of those two agencies, then there was a working group established, working together and trying to find and harmonize the requirements and to come to an agreement. It's not always possible to come to an agreement, but at least there is really a very high interest and intention to harmonize as much as possible and to come at least to a compatible pediatric global development program.
Thank you. So the next question is from Dr. Treem. To help with sustainability of pediatric clinical trial infrastructure across the European Union, what do you anticipate will be the role of individual member state governments in ongoing support for these networks? So maybe I can answer this first. I think many member state governments are interested in supporting trial networks. What the networks need to do is develop a business case to capture that interest. These efforts have been successful in the UK, in Switzerland, in Austria, and in Finland. Although in Finland, it's the individual cities that fund healthcare, not the government. So in several countries, there have been successful cases made to governments, and other countries have indicated their interest in doing this if we can develop business cases as national networks. So I'm in Copenhagen today, and the Danish network is making that business case to its government. And I know that the other Scandinavian countries are doing the same. We're in France on Tuesday talking about that, how to lobby the French government. The Spanish, the Italians, the Dutch, the Belgians are doing this as well. So we're working together to use existing good practice to persuade more and more governments to sustain national networks. Irmgard, any comment?
No, thank you. The only comment again was that also in the announcement of the potentially future IMI call for this pan-European clinical trial network, the sustainability of such a network is a key issue, and it is also suggested that governments could contribute or should contribute, and it will be up to the various sites and networks to really build up the business case as you have been mentioning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Dr. Treem. Thank you, Dr. Treem. Has there been any effort between the national pediatric networks to adopt uniform processes and procedures that will make it possible for a sponsor to conduct a trial using multiple national pediatric networks? So the answer here is yes, but it's quite a small yes. The conversations have started, but we need to take those conversations further in the next few years. And as Irmgard says, it may be that there's a good role to play for the proposed IMI2 network if that gets funded. But as I say, the national networks do talk to each other already, and this goal is certainly something that people are talking about. Irmgard?
No, I don't have anything to add to what you have been answering.
Okay, thank you. And the last question on the board at the moment, again from Dr. Treem. Has there been progress in having Enpr-EMA act as a facilitator for rapidly convened multi-stakeholder meetings between networks, brackets academia, regulators and sponsors, brackets industry and non-industry, focused on problematic areas of clinical trials? Irmgard, maybe you could go first.
Yeah, well, Enpr-EMA already has organized a few of those multi-stakeholder meetings, for instance, in the field of diabetes, where there is a huge problem with many simultaneous agreed PIPs, and it's really difficult to recruit in those trials. And there was a meeting where industry and academia networks have been invited to. We had on other areas multi-stakeholder meetings to discuss outcome measures, for instance, in the field of cystic fibrosis and so on. We are still, it's still work in progress, I would say, because since Enpr-EMA is hosted by the EMA, we also have to rely on a kind of framework that is currently in elaboration by the EMA on how to interact with academia and networks. So this is hopefully finalized very soon, and I think that we really can restart convening multi-stakeholder meetings by next year.
I'm afraid I've got nothing to add to that. Are there any other questions or topics that people want to express or discuss? A couple of other people have been typing, but nothing's appeared yet.
So we will wait until we receive the question.
So
the question
Dr.
is,
Fracasso,
will Enpr-EMA?
Yeah.
Mark, please go ahead.
Okay. Will Enpr-EMA have a role in the creation of the pan-EU network in IMI2 call 10? The indicative text for this call, which is available on the IMI2 Future Proposals webpage, includes explicit mention of EMA activities in many parts of that call, and in every work package. So EMA, I believe, has committed to working with the network if it's funded, and I understand that Enpr-EMA would be the main focus for the EMA's activities. But Irmgard may have more detail.
Yes, there is commitment that Enpr-EMA definitely will have to play an important role, but it will have to be waited until a consortium has been created and has obtained the funding. So until this has been established, and we do not yet know what kind. First of all, the call has not been launched, but after the launch, we have to wait until a consortium has been established, and then there will be a collaboration with the winning consortium.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So maybe if you do not have any questions right away, you're very much invited, and you would have questions that come to your mind a little bit later, to submit them in writing, and we will be glad and delighted to reply to you in writing. So I think if no further questions are being put forward, I really would like to thank all the participants. I do hope that the information provided in the presentation has answered some of your questions. We will put the presentations on the EMA website with a link to the webinar, and together with the questions and the answers. And as mentioned, please, whenever you have a question, feel free to contact Enpr-EMA via the email address enprema@ema.europa.eu, and we will come back to you. Mark, please, you will have the last word.
Well, thank you. All I can do is echo Irmgard's thanks to all the people all the participants. But I think we also need to express our appreciation to Isabel and colleagues at EMA for hosting this so flawlessly. And please get in touch through the email if there's anything that anybody can do to help.
And with this, we would like to say goodbye and have a very good either rest of the morning or afternoon and day. Thank you. Goodbye.